have to shoot you now. He does so have to shoot me now. I demand that you shoot me now.
Animated films aren't real, yet people feel linked to the stories and characters on screen. This is because the films have a strong use of realism, the quality of representation of a person or thing in a way that is accurate to life. Realism in film wasn't as widely considered until the 1930s with the screening of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first feature-length animated film, which also introduced realism to the medium. By pushing the boundaries of animation, Disney used the real world as an inspiration for their stories and characters. Film critics in the 1930s studied the visual realism of film and felt put off by how real the characters appeared, from their movements to the overall appearance, mostly the human characters. They were not convinced animation could tell a story in a feature film. In recent years, the subject of realism has grown and developed beyond just the visuals, but how it can connect with the audience. Because the more realistic a character appears, the easier it is for an audience to accept it as a real character. What sets animation apart from other films is that live action is a collection of photographic images, whilst animation is hand-drawn or modeled as a puppet. Realism is essential to bridge the audience to the film because without realism, it becomes harder for the audience to care about the characters and, by extension, the story. However, realism can be overused. When the movement and visuals become too realistic, the result can be off. I'll be covering some of the key aspects of realism and how they're used to grab the attention of the audience and when they're used effectively in film. The use of realism and its most effective applications have been widely discussed. From describing the aesthetic visuals, characters acting appropriately to their environments, settings, to how they were inspired and not direct copies of the physical world.
It can get weirder.
As realism is a vast subject, theorists like Stephen Rowley split it into 5 aspects or spectrums: oral, visual, social, character narrative, and motion. These aspects of realism allows the audience to feel attached to the characters and bring them to life. For the purpose of this extended research project, I'll be focusing primarily on oral, motion, and visual realism. As I will explain, they are dependent on each other. If one was out of sync, it can cause confusion and imbalance, heading towards the uncanny valley. Using Paul Well's studies on memories of Disney films and how it can affect children into their adult lives, correlating it with John Dicey's studies on neurology, how our brains relate to the characters and why we recognize certain poses or expressions as certain emotions. Stephen Rowley's essay, Life Reproduced in Drawings, Preliminary Comments upon Realism in Animation, focuses on the aspects of realism and how animated films were viewed in the 1930s. To highlight my points, I'll use How to Train Your Dragon and how the film succeeds in using oral, visual, and motion realism to capture the audience's imagination with its relatable characters. Visual realism is the extent the animated characters and environment are understood by the audience, as they are a representation of real environments and characters. Realism in this instance relates primarily to the film's appearance, the character design, and how detailed the backgrounds are. The visuals are a window that allows the audience to see the world and experience it along with the characters. It's the core realism that supports the other spectrums of realism, especially motion and audio. Furthermore, the visuals help stimulate certain emotions in the audience. For instance, the color grading and small effects in certain scenes in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs are used to evoke a mood. For example, the subtle color change in the backgrounds to murky and dark as Snow White enters the Forbidden Forest. Additionally, it provides depth to the backgrounds, such as mold stains, stone cracks, and pot marks. These small details render the background less flat and more lifelike as the character interacts with the environment. In the film Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the audience is introduced to a world heavily influenced by a comic book aesthetic. This allows the audience to accept moments when something otherwise out of place occurs, such as speech bubbles and split screens. With its spectacular visuals and color grading, it helps set the tone, whether it's uplifting or a moment of danger. The visuals of the film stimulate the audience's imagination, brings a sense of reality to the fictional world, and makes the audience feel that they themselves are part of it. In recent years, animated films have become more visually realistic, with photographic backgrounds that could be misinterpreted as the real world. Steven Spielberg's The Adventures of Tintin, Secret of the Unicorn, was praised for its spectacular visuals and storytelling. However, something felt off. In the first few minutes, some of the early audiences perceived it as a live-action film. Not so much on account of the backgrounds, which looked like they were filmed in a street, but with the characters that looked almost too real, with skin that wrinkles, eyes that dilate, and hair that reflects light. This was stepping into the uncanny valley, when a character being looks too human and its non-human imperfections become unsettling to the viewer. In the early 20th century, researcher Ernest Chentz described the uncanny valley as a mental state in which a person is unable to distinguish what is real or imagined, or dead or alive. It's also been known, once the characters have been identified as a digital character, the unsettling feeling that, once provoked, will linger on in the mind. This can have the potential to cause discomfort in the audience, distract them from the story, and prevent them from bonding with the characters. The character designs are also a factor in how easily an audience relates to a character. In a study conducted by Edward Schneider, 60 participants rated still images of various characters in terms of human likeness and a level of attractiveness. Results show that anthropomorphic characters were considered more relatable than those deemed more human-like. These studies also conclude that exaggerated human proportions, such as enlarged nose or head shape, were more appealing and therefore more likable than exact digital copies. A character like Bugs Bunny from Looney Tunes, who acts human and has human-like appendages, is more relatable and mentally acceptable to the audience, whereas characters like the Evil Queen and Snow White were perceived as yucky, the former more than the latter, and induce fear in children. This is because people can easily project human-like qualities like emotions to an animal, as they don't show emotion as strongly as humans do. As technology improved, audiences grew more accustomed to the photographic visuals in animated films, such as in Toy Story 4. The environment had so many lifelike elements that it felt a little like a live-action film. Nevertheless, the film applied realism from its debut in 1995. The creators managed to create characters who mirrored humans in the real world while still being relatable. They avoided stepping into the uncanny valley. Realism is not only about the visuals, it's about how they create the illusion of life through movement. For a character to be alive, it needs to move. The characters reveal itself through motion, the way they walk, and how they physically react to certain situations. In Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Disney was able to push the boundaries in animation with movements that showed weight and fluidity that was almost lifelike. Critics found Disney's departure from what were the commonly accepted features of animation at the time, exaggerated movements and the bending of reality, odd. The movements of the characters were too realistic, which they found unsettling. Motion realism is the extent in which characters move in a fashion that is understood by the audience as resembling the way characters move in the actual physical world. The use of motion did vary between the characters. For instance, all the human characters like Snow White and the Prince used live reference so the animators could capture the movements and rotoscope them, which resulted in their movements being almost identical to the real world. In contrast, the movements of the animals and dwarves had some squash and stretch, creating an interpretation of life. Each of the dwarves were given a distinctive movement, which endeared them to the audience. Despite the subtle details, critics were unimpressed with Disney's way of animating, believing it was unnecessary and that it should stick to the quick gags and bending of reality of Steamboat Willie. But audiences loved Snow White. Disney was the pinnacle of animation realism in the 1930s because they knew how to balance motion realism and when to employ more traditional forms of animation for their characters. Oral realism is when sound from animated environments and characters are understood by the audience as resembling sounds from the physical world. Sound is subjective, as what the audience hears, just as what it sees, may not correlate with the real world. For example, when a cartoon character stops abruptly with their heels, the accompanying sound might be like the car tires screeching. Much like the previous spectrums of realism, the audience will accept this sound provided it corresponds with what they see. A lot of early Disney films used music scores and instruments for their sound effects. It was valuable in sparking the audience's imagination and drawing them into the story. Sound was used to support the visuals, adding to their impact and evoking emotions. The advent of talking films, the talkies, was a revolution in film industry. When sound was first introduced in film, it grabbed the audience's attention. The addition of sound made films more realistic. Initially, it was believed that the music scores in film was more important than the dialogue. Music helped animation distinguish itself from live-action film. Steamboat Willie was Disney's first animated film to synchronize visuals and audio and set a new standard in the industry. It was so influential, the practice of using sound and time with movements to advance the plot was called Mickey Mousing. This iconic use of sound bolstered the realism of film. Magical aspects only occur when the music notes appear on screen. The use of audio has expanded considerably since Steamboat Willie. Today, animators use sound to emulate real-life emotions and characters using either a large sound library, numbering in the tens of thousands, or by creating new sounds. Musical scores are used to create atmosphere. It is a different type of narrative. Scott Curtis says musical sound effects are defined not by what they are, but by an analogy. However, Chuck Jones, a Warner Brothers animator, believed animated cartoons used music sync incorrectly from 1930 to 1950. Studios were more focused on exact synchronization, Mickey Mousing, and weren't letting the music score do its job. In The Rabbit of Seville, Jones illustrated what he meant about letting the music do its job. The short in which the antics of Bugs Bunny are set to the beat of Rosny's The Barber of Seville is one of the most memorable Looney Tunes shorts because of its enchanting use of the music correlating with the action. Moreover, the music is an extent to the humor. To achieve this, Jones used a method called zip crash. Treg Brown, the main sound designer in Warner Brothers, created sound using real objects that spectators would subconsciously recognize. The objective was not to replicate the real-life sound of any action, but to convey the appropriate feeling in the film. For instance, Roadrunner's tongue sound was Treg Brown's thumb in a glass Coca-Cola bottle. For the use of sound to be effective, the sound must be something the audience can recognize. Sound was used sparingly, only for key poses and characters to help emphasize important actions or settings of the film. In recent films, not only are more sound effects being applied, sound is being layered. It can make a big impact. However, it comes with the risk of confusing the audience. Too many unnecessary sounds becomes clustered and messy. Lee R. Bobker declared, "The less sound used, the better the film." If a character has a distinctive sound, something people can instantly recognize, it has the power to evoke a sense of nostalgia and history. If it sounds authentic, it makes the character more credible. The sound designer must create a sound that is distinctive to the character, whether that be humorous, sweet, powerful, or scary. Many blockbuster films use sound to provide a narrative, allowing the audience to build a story around them. In WALL-E, the noises he makes are easily understandable, depicting his emotion with high tones or mechanical sounds. WALL-E is relatable to the audience to an emotional level due to humans having a general elementary motor mimicry of other expressive behaviors, creating a stimulus matching emotional experience. When we see or hear a physical expression, it triggers an impulse in us to mimic it. For instance, when WALL-E closes his hands together, this creates a lonely feeling in the audience, with some copying the action or looking at their own hands. In the case of sound, we as people will naturally accept sound if they are appropriate. If characters sound too similar, it becomes harder to determine which is which. This creates a disconnection to the audience and reduces our emotional attachment to the characters and, by extension, the story. Background music is another way to stimulate the audience through sound, whether it's an anticipation, action, thrill, or suspense. The music is one of the key ways to engage the audience to the film. The music is not part of realism in the film. However, it does assist in the building of connection between the audience and the characters. Just as there are memorable characters, there are memorable songs that accompany them. The Godzilla main title in Godzilla King of the Monsters has a unique use of string and brass accompaniment that emphasizes the weight and power of the monster. Also, the song was a remake of the main theme by Akira Ifukube from the original Godzilla. This use of music signals to the audience a character's arrival, building tension and excitement. Furthermore, once the audience has heard it a couple of times, the audience will start associating the piece to a setting or character. Sound, motion, and visuals. These aspects of realism are instrumental in connecting the audience with the characters, and How to Train Your Dragon is an example of a film that utilizes those realisms. The film centers around a young Viking named Hiccup and his one-of-a-kind dragon, Toothless, living in a hostile, antagonistic environment. They begin as enemies and become inseparable partners. This film has become one of the most successful franchises from DreamWorks, spawning 2 sequels, a trilogy, and a television series. The first film's success was in part due to its attention to detail, from the scales of the dragons to the clouds and ripples on water in the environment and the way they told their story. The biggest hook was the character interaction as well as the characters themselves. Each character felt unique, allowing the audience to connect with them on a personal level, especially Toothless, with his actions and design that revealed he was less the ferocious monster he was first presented as and more like an adored family pet. When the film opens, the audience is introduced to Burt, a land of bucolic islands of green hills and flourishing with sheep. From this peaceful beginning, we shift immediately into chaos as dragons raid it. This establishes the reality to the audience, using imagery. Visually, the film uses photographic-like details for the environment from flames, houses, and the forests. In addition, the detailed aesthetics on the characters' hair and skin are quite realistic, but not so much so that it breaches into the uncanny valley. The characters have exaggerated features, such as shapely heads, larger eyes, and oversized hair. This was done purposely through designing the character's body with more angular shapes. Stoic has a square build and irregular length of facial hair, whilst Hiccup has a smaller frame and a rounder head to suggest he's scrawny but intelligent and relies on his head rather than his muscles. The audience can relate more to Hiccup because he stands out from the crowd. The dragon's visual designs cannot be said to be realistically drawn, as dragons don't exist. However, the creators gave them features the audience would recognize as belonging to large reptiles, birds, and mammals. Much of the designs stray away from the standard giant reptile with 4 legs and a set of wings. For example, Toothless has a strong resemblance to a black panther with bat-like wings. The dragons are diverse and individual, which makes them more believable. Just as we can project emotions on anthropomorphic characters, the same can be done on the dragons, as their animal inspiration, in addition to their human likeness, make them feel more real than just a standard giant reptilian beast that breathes fire. The main antagonist, the Red Death, looks far more monstrous with a huge body and 6 eyes. The audience accepts that this world has dragons. However, this dragon towers above all others in size, strength, and ruthlessness. It seems unlikely the heroes can take down such a beast. Furthermore, unlike the other dragons, the Red Death doesn't resemble an animal the audience would recognize. It's a true monster. Each character, whether it be a dragon or Viking, has a distinctive set of movements. The dragon's movements are more expressive, adopting movements from birds, bees, and reptiles. Toothless behaves more intellectually, setting him apart from the other dragons. An audience can identify with a character if they share a likeness with them. In this instance, all people appreciate the dragons when they act like pets. Motion, above all other spectrums, plays the most important role in achieving realism in the film. Despite it being a fantasy world, all things have a natural use of motion, from small movements, the twitch of a hand, the flickering of a flame, shows that the world has more depth, further hooking the viewers into the world. Although they do have moments of exaggeration, such as characters falling from the skies and being kicked out of frame. They are used appropriately to add humor or excitement, most notably when Hiccup and Toothless learn to fly together. The audio used for this film reinforces the film's motion and visual realism. As sound can be subjective, its effectiveness is dependent on its correlation with action and events on screen. With dragons being fiction, the sound they produce are a mix of various animals and people. In many dinosaur or monster movies, the creatures have a standard sound, which makes it harder for their characters to be memorable. However, in this film, Toothless and his fellow dragons each have a unique voice. Toothless is primarily a mix of horses, elephants, and pigs with additional sounds made by a person, creating a convincing animal-like sound to convey a personality and emotion. This allows the audience to identify each dragon as its own type and differentiate between them. The background sounds help to build the atmosphere, establishing the environment around the characters as well as the audience. All actions, large or small, have a sound to add to the sense of reality, from crashing waves to fireplaces' fires to a pencil falling on a stone. Like Rabbit of Seville, How to Train Your Dragon timed the action to the score. This is most evident in Forbidden Friendship and Test Flight, where the characters are establishing a bond of trust and the climactic moments when they become a team. The actions build up the mood in conjunction with the music to charm the audience and immerse them in the scene. The music not only adds to the atmosphere, it replaces dialogue, with the characters being silent or using few words. The music was used to describe the emotion the characters were feeling.
Come on!
Advances in technology has led to recent animated films becoming so realistic it can be difficult to differentiate between animation and reality. How to Train Your Dragon utilized modern technology to make the film visually real, but used reality as an inspiration rather than a direct copy. The film has its flaws, with minor characters not being too relevant to the story. But these small points are easily ignored because of the incredible use of storytelling and visuals enchanting the audience. It's the attention to the smallest detail, the spectacular backgrounds and realistic motion visuals being supported by the audio, and the design of the characters. None of it would have had a strong of an impact to the viewers if they weren't all in sync. The realism was there, in the main characters to the finer details of the world around them. There are a lot of films out there. Some use realism well and others not so much. It's easy to judge a film purely on how realistic it looks and completely ignore the story, but that's not why people watch these films. They watch them because they enjoy the story, the characters, and feel they can be part of that world. Films in the modern day have become more visually stunning and have used the technology to push the capacity of storytelling. But photographic visuals, authentic sound, and precise motion doesn't guarantee the film will be good. Films like How to Train Your Dragon and Spider-Verse wouldn't have been as successful if they didn't have the technology to help with their audio-visual aspects. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs proved that animation was as good a medium as live-action films for telling meaningful stories and creating iconic characters. Animated characters, from mythical creatures to cartoonish humans to anthropomorphic creatures, have the power to trigger emotions in the audience. Animated films may not be real, but they can still be believable in the eyes of the people with whom they connect with.